This is the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast with Wayne Scott and Garry Taylor.
On this episode, we explore the story of manual gearboxes in Aston Martin. Do they have a future?
Discover more about the story of Aston Martin. amht.org.uk.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. I'm Wayne Scott, and also we have...
Garry Taylor, hello.
Hey Gary, here we are, already episode 4. The year's speeding by, and mainly because there's lots of good Aston Martin stuff to talk about.
There certainly is. Aston Martin are keeping us busy, aren't they, Wayne?
They are indeed. We'll talk about what's been happening in motorsport a bit later on in this episode. As is normal for me, the last weekend in January is spent glued to the TV throughout the night watching the Rolex Daytona 24 Hours. It's a weird race, a race of weird weather as well, one that mixes sort of winter and summer all in one race. Brilliant stuff though, and Aston Martin did really well. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in this episode. But first, we have a brand new Aston Martin to talk about, and it is the DBX 707. It is the SUV, of course, that Aston Martin have been selling for some time. It's had a complete revamp and refresh, and it's phenomenally popular, this car, isn't it? There was an argument that Aston Martin, as we've touched on before on this podcast, shouldn't be making SUVs, but the market disagreed, and people have been buying this in their droves.
They have been. Should they be making this sort of thing? Well, the last financial year, from what I understand, I think about 54% of all Aston Martin sold last year were the DBX. It's working for them. It really is working for them, and I think we're going to see more variations of the car. So they've got this great car. It is selling. People want it. I think, as I said previously, more Aston, more days. People are using these, and I think it was Aston Martin Bristol said to me when I spoke to them recently, they said they're having their cars back. These DBXs are coming back with some phenomenal mileages on them. People are using these cars. So, hey, they're buying the cars and they are using them. They're not garage queens by any stretch.
Well, the DBX V8 had amazing performance statistics. I'll run you through the top 3. 181 miles an hour top speed. 542 PS. That's like new power. It's not. They don't do brake horsepower anymore.
I've looked into that. It's a metric measure of horsepower, and it's, here's my German, Führerstag.
Ah, very good.
that's through you. I think you were in awe of my German.
I am absolutely in awe. I'm very impressed with that, actually.
It's been about an hour's rehearsal to say that beforehand. So.
Excellent. Well, that's what it is, and it was only 542 on the DBX V8. I say only, that's massive, whopping power for an SUV, and it would take you to 62 miles an hour in just 4.5 seconds. Compare that to the DBX 707, and they're up to just shy of 200 miles an hour now. 193 is the top speed they're claiming, 707 PS on the power, and a 0 to 62 time of 3.3 seconds. I mean, that's just ridiculously quick for an SUV, isn't it?
It is. We were speaking just before the podcast of say how cars, the engineers, the technology has moved on. We were talking about some old Range Rovers. And as you say, we have well, let's not be shy, it's a heavy car, as most SUVs are. But we have this DBX 707, which I found out in old money is 697 bhp. I can see 707 be a bit more catchy in marketing terms, so that's probably why they've used it. But I say 0 to 62 and 3.3, that is mind-boggling. And Aston Martin have said that they're just not just bolting more horsepower into the car to make it go faster and to be unruly. I think most manufacturers can just make the thing bigger and go faster, but you've got to be able to drive it. And I think they have championed the fact that this DBX has more power. I think, what's it say here? It's 155 brake horsepower increase over the regular DBX. Can you believe that? But it can handle it. You can still enjoy driving the car. It's still swift. It's not a brute. You're not going to get into it and think, oh my God, what have I got myself into here? So, yeah, hats off to Aston Martin for bringing this together. I think there was some talk of the faster DBX being the V12, and I think we all like the idea of a V12 and a DBX, but I think, as they've said, that would just totally change the dynamic of the DBX. It's a bigger engine, heavier engine, and they've gone for an updated V8. So this is what we have, and my goodness, it's phenomenal.
I can't wait to hear it, how it sounds, but you make the point there, of course, that it has to be a daily driver. This is a sports utility vehicle, and it has to be usable day to day. So it has been quite a feat of engineering, really, to make that much power pack into a vehicle that needs to take the kids on the school run and go to the supermarket and the DIY shop and all of that kind of everyday stuff that they want you to use it for, and yet it's packing that kind of performance figures that normally would be a fire-breathing monster.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've all perhaps driven cars that are a bit too not too gentle around town and bimbling around. They just want to get unleashed. But from what I understand, that this car, it's going to be still a little pussycat around town for the school run. To your favourite local supermarket and all the rest of it. It's not going to be hard work. But if you want to take it out for a spin, for a track day, I think the launch control systems and all the rest that they've bolted on. It's also got a new 9-speed wet clutch gearbox as well, so just to handle this. So it's a very usable car, and it's going to be great to look at. They've done a subtle change on the front of it. I think it's the biggest grille of an Aston Martin that's ever been fitted on the DBX, but they've subtly redesigned it, and the grille just seems to hang from above. It's got a lovely splitter underneath it, so they've done... The design team have done a lovely job on this car. They certainly haven't spoilt it by making it look like putting spoilers and wings all over it. It does look very much like a gentle person's Aston Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. Looks a lot more aggressive, but has lost none of the style and finesse that we know and love of Aston Martin. And it's fantastic to see a car company who are using power and performance and speed to sell a car again. When they launched it, the website for the launch was newseatofpower.com.
Yes.
I like it. I'm all up for this stuff.
I think you're right, and I think it's not just for Aston Martin. I think it's the car manufacturers. It's the last hurrah for the combustion engines, if you like, and they're making the most of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, suck it in, enjoy it, take it all in, soak this up.
Having said that, we've got a V12 Vantage, which we're not going to talk about, but it's not the end of the V12 and power. We got the V12 Vantage at some point, announced in December. Still no sign or any more information on it, but hopefully we're still going to have power to come.
Absolutely. In the great tradition of Aston Martin, and it is of tradition we talk next, because, Gary, you've been back behind the scenes at the Aston Martin Heritage Trust to meet, Rob Smith, the Aston Martin Heritage Trust chairman, to find out about his work and his views on the future of the Aston Martin Heritage Trust.
Trust Talk. We take you behind the scenes at the Aston Martin Heritage Trust.
Well, I'm delighted today that I'm at the Aston Martin Heritage Trust to be with the chairman of the Board of Trustees, Rob Smith. Now, we're going to talk about the Aston Martin Heritage Trust, its history, why it was formed, etc. But before we get on to that, Robert, I want to talk about your latest acquisition.
Absolutely. Well, it's a sort of Aston Martin. Back in the 1980s, Aston Martin spun off their engineering department as Aston Martin Tickford Limited. And the idea was to sell their automotive services elsewhere in the industry. And their very first customer was a company called Fraser Cars Limited, and they made 26 luxury metros called the Fraser Tickford Metro. So I've just bought one of those that's been in bits for 20 years to restore.
You're doing it yourself, aren't you?
I'm doing as much of it as I possibly can myself. The challenge, believe it or not, with something like a Metro is getting the bits. Unlike an Aston Martin, where 90-odd% of them survive, almost no Metros survive from the 2.8 million built. So it's really hard to get some parts. So I'm trying to find all the bits I need first.
Well, I think this car's going to be very fascinating. I think it's probably the pre-Signet. Would you suggest it's the pre-Signet, a small car from Aston Martin?
Exactly, it's exactly the same model. They wanted to take a city car and give it the luxury Aston Martin touch. So that's what they set out to do.
Thanks, Rob. Well, looking forward to covering the Fraser and the Signet in future episodes. But before we go on to that, I I want to talk to you about the Aston Martin Heritage Trust. Now, some people get confused between the Aston Martin Owners Club and the Aston Martin Heritage Trust. So can you just give us a brief overview as to why it was formed and when it was formed?
So the Aston Martin Heritage Trust was formed in 1998 by the Owners Club. In those days, there was great risk of legal proceedings against the club if something went wrong, and they felt that they needed to set up a charitable trust to protect what was then the 1934 Aston Martin Ulster that they owned, and a small but interesting collection of artefacts. So they formed the trust as a educational charity to protect those assets in case something went horribly wrong. Fortunately, it never did. Since then, the trust has been building up the collection in so many different ways.
You mentioned the educational side of things, because that is very important to the trust, isn't it? It's not just a collection of art cars and archive.
No, it's very important because it's actually in our constitution. The trust was set up to do two things. Firstly, to record and collect absolutely everything to do with Aston Martin's history, and then secondly, to share that information with anybody who was interested and wanted to know more. So the education side of things is how we share all the information and the knowledge we're gaining here.
What's the relationship it has today with the Owners Club?
We have friends of the trust, and every Aston Martin Owners Club member is automatically a friend of the trust, and the club transfers some funds to us for each one of those members. So we have a good relationship with the club. We share our headquarters at the moment in Drayton St Leonard, and we support the club in all the activities they do, such as the big concours events each year.
Important source of the archive material and the cars is actually Aston Martin Lagonda itself, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and we enjoy a great relationship with Aston Martin. We are their official archive. We even have our own cupboard in the corner under the stairs in the factory at Gaydon, and we encourage them to throw absolutely nothing away. They should put it in the cupboard, and then it comes to us, and then we can decide which things that they're trying to throw away should form part of the permanent archive.
That cupboard sounds fascinating. You must love going there to pick things up.
Absolutely, because you never quite know what they've found next. So we get all sorts of things like recently they refurbished the VIP configuration suite. So all of the leather samples and wheels and seats that were in there all came to us for storage for perpetuity.
I believe we received a car or a cutaway fairly recently, just a few weeks ago. Well, I'll say a few weeks ago. Well, that was probably back in January, February. What was that?
Yeah, that was in January. So yes, the latest vehicle that we've received from Aston Martin is the Rapide Cutaway. So that was built and toured the motor shows of the world to show the electric Rapide that they were building. And it has all the electric motors and all the housings where the batteries would have been. And the idea was that they all sat where the normal transmission would have been. And so we can use that cutaway to explain electric vehicles and how Aston Martin are getting started in that part of the market.
Well, that's going to be fascinating because, electric vehicles are the way forward. And I think Aston Martin have announced themselves recently that they're going, certainly from 2030, fully electric. And the Rapide E is probably the first version to do that car.
It was very much a test bed. It enabled them to explore all sorts of areas, not just with the car, but how did you store the batteries? What sort of training did people need? How did you protect the workforce when they were working on these things? Because they run at 800 volts, the system, so you don't want to stick your fingers in the wrong socket. Unfortunately, the car didn't make it to production because the legislation was changing faster than Aston Martin could develop the car. But it's very much their first toe in the water and the beginnings of, as you say, we will see a lot more electric Astons to come.
I think people may associate the Heritage Trust, rightly or wrongly, with cars. How many cars do you have in the collection now?
Well, we currently have 27 cars. Some of those are on permanent loan from Aston Martin Lagonda and the Nimrod from Viscountess Down, but the rest of the cars are in our own collection. 27 in total, ranging from A3, the oldest Aston Martin to survive, right up to the Rapide E Cutaway, which is, to all intents and purposes, brand new.
I think the cutaways do draw a lot of interest because you can actually, well, sounds a nothing to say, but you can actually see inside the car the construction of the vehicles, and they are a fascinating item, aren't they?
They are, and we find that people who come to the museum find them really interesting. It's not that difficult to see a complete Aston Martin on the roads these days, but to see what's underneath the skin and the technology that goes into an Aston Martin is really interesting. And we've got cutaways that show the aluminium tub, the chassis, if you like. We've got others which are drivetrain cutaways, which show cutaway engines in gearboxes and back axles. We've got others like the Vanquish cutaway, which shows all the carbon fibre bodywork. And gosh, they're huge pieces of carbon fibre, and that you would never know that from looking at the finished car.
It's not just cars, is it? We have a lot of other stuff.
Oh, we have an awful lot of other stuff. It runs to hundreds of thousands of items. So in terms of physical artefacts, we've got a big trophy cabinet, including things like the 1959 World Sports Car Championship Winners' Trophy, and other trophies from the 1950s that were all given to us by the Brown family. We've got cabinets showing items from the Bamford and Martin days, including a silver tea service that was won by Lionel Martin in his cycling days. We've got cabinets showing a big scale model collection, which enables us to demonstrate all sorts of cars that we couldn't possibly hope to own, much as we'd like to. We've got cabinets which show trim items. We've got others that show engineering items and the tools the engineers would have used in the day to make these cars.
How do you store these items?
Well, the paper archive is very difficult to look after because it includes photographs and film, of course, is a very unstable medium. We've also got loads of engineering drawings too. So they're all stored in our archive. We spend a small fortune on all the right packaging to look after these things. They all have to be in acid-free boxes and acid-free wallets. And we spend a small fortune on that sort of thing. We also employ professional conservators where that's appropriate to look after some of the items we've been given.
With this amazing collection of cars and archive material, we are struggling for space, aren't we?
We're absolutely full. We've got cars in storage all over the place, and our archive area is congested, to say the least. So we're looking at plans to fund and create a new Aston Martin Heritage Centre in order to be able to move the archive and the museum and do everything on a much bigger scale.
Do you have a model, like perhaps like the British Motor Museum or Ferrari Museum? Do you have a model in mind that you ultimately like to achieve? I say you achieve, I mean the trustees.
We've been to look at a lot of the competition, if you like, including the Ferrari and Lamborghini museums, who are perhaps the closest to us in scope. But one of the things we want to do particularly is to surround each car in the collection with the ephemera that goes with it. We think an awful lot of the importance in the Aston Martin story is the people that were involved, the people who built the cars, the people who owned the company, the people who buy the cars. It isn't just a case of putting a car on a pedestal and saying, isn't that beautiful? It's what were the social circumstances around the building and selling of that car as well. So we want to really tell the whole story, not just produce an art gallery of beautiful cars.
Aston Martin has a tremendous history of interesting characters and people behind this, and I think it'd be great to be able to celebrate those people. Rob, thank you very much for your time, and no doubt we'll speak again soon.
Thank you, my pleasure.
You're listening to the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Discover more about the story of Aston Martin, the cars, the people, the history, with the Aston Martin Heritage Trust. You're always welcome to visit us at our museum in Oxfordshire, so find out more via amht.org.uk.
Well, we've talked a lot about him here on the podcast over the past 4 episodes. It was good to finally hear from Rob Smith himself about his chairmanship of the Aston Martin Heritage Trust, and it is amazing. All of the people that sit on the board at the Trust and do all of that great work are all volunteers, aren't they, Gary?
They are. They're all volunteers. They all spend their time. Each of us got a role. As I say, Rob is the chairman. I'm the treasurer and I do these podcasts as well. We have Tim, who is the registrar, and he does amazing things on getting cars re-registered. A lot of dating certificates, and we hope to get Tim on the podcast soon to talk us through how he gets a car reauthorised, if you like, with the DVLA. And we have John Warden, who does the educational side things of the trust, and plenty of other trustees as well. And we have two trustees, Marek Reitman and Mark Gauntlet from AML, who represent the AML's point of view, and a couple from the AMOC as well. So we all volunteers, we all contribute it, and we've got some great plans for the trust.
I understand it's having a bit of a makeover at the moment.
Yes, it is. We're having a tidy up, I think, effectively. We've been at the barn now for about 20 years, and we are getting so much stuff, which is such great news. But it's getting crammed. It's getting busy. And with the COVID restrictions, if you like, at the beginning of the year, and it's relatively quiet for people not going to the museum, we took it as an opportunity to just close the museum for a couple of months. It's going to reopen again on the February the 23rd or thereabouts. And we have moved everything from upstairs, all the archive material, downstairs, and we've given a place a good clean and tidy up and refresh, and we're slowly moving it all back, and we're going to have some new cars downstairs as well. We have some of the cars in secure outbuildings, and we do like to rotate these around, so once the museum's open again, we've got some new cars downstairs and a nice smell of pledge within the museum.
Well, sounds like an ideal opportunity then to go and see the new look Aston Martin Heritage Trust Museum. You can find out all the details as ever at amht.org.uk. Best day out ever. So go and have a look at the website, find out all the details to come and see us and the new look collection. Back to the news on motorsport. It was, at the end of January, one of the big ticket races, of course, of the sports car season. It is one of the big uns. It is the Daytona 24-hour race, sponsored by Rolex, of course, all part of the IMSA Championship over there in America. And Aston Martin have had their first podium of the modern era. And it went to roughly local Magnus racing team, racing in GTD. And they came second, and they have three American drivers, John Potter, Andy Lally, Spencer Pumperly, and our own Brit, good old Johnny Adam, guiding that team, I get the feeling, because those GTD cars must have a pro driver in the lineup, and they managed P2. So the first podium position at the Rolex 24 Hours at Daytona took place, of course, started on January the 30th. A great result for Aston Martin there, and there were several other Aston Martins in the field as well. Down in 8th place was the next highest, with Roman de Angelis, Ian James, Tom Gamble, and of course our own Brit, Darren Turner, who has such a massive history racing Aston Martins. They came in at 8th position in the Rolex 24 Hours. That was Daytona for 2022. Brilliant result for Aston Martin all round, and even more exciting stuff from Aston Martin Racing, because in the last few days, Gary, we've seen the brand new Formula One car for the 2022 season.
We have, and it's known as the AMR 22. It's launched into a new era for Formula One. I think the whole rulebook has been ripped up. It's going to be Aston Martin's second year, and as I say, the rulebook's going to be ripped up, not just for Aston Martin, but for all the teams. The car's going to look very significantly different. And I think from the outside, the biggest visual changes is going to be the wheels and the ground effect styling of the cars. We're now on 18-inch wheels and low-profile tyres. So they're going to look very special on a car, and the car was launched alongside Sebastian Vettel and Lance Stroll, and Lawrence Stroll gave the introduction to it, and it's part of their second year into a 5-year plan to win the championship. Their expectations for this year are relatively, I would say, low. Say it's a brand new car, and once you start mucking around with the aero, they're moving more to ground effect type of cars. It changes everything. The tyres have changed, the ground effects changed, the whole thing. The wings have changed. The rear wing appears to be much smaller. So it's going to be a massive learning curve, and I think during the introduction they've said this car is going to be changing a lot through the year. Some teams are going to get it right from the off, and some teams are going to perhaps struggle. We don't know where Aston Martin's going to be. Nobody knows where they're going to be, any of the teams. So it's going to be a very exciting year ahead. I think they would like to see themselves on the podium a few times. Outright wins, I'm not so sure. I don't think they're looking towards that. But where did they finish last year? I think they finished 7th out of 10 manufacturers or something like that. So I think they're certainly looking for an improvement for next year, and I think we'd like to see a few podiums. But it's the Silverstone complex where these cars are ultimately going to be built is coming on nicely. I think that's opening next year. So let's wait and see what's going to happen. It's Bahrain is next month. The car's ready. And what is encouraged, Wayne, is that Aston Martin actually showed the car that they're going to be racing. I think Red Bull, a few days earlier, they showed a car. Well, it wasn't the car that's going to appear on the track in Bahrain. I think they were being very secretive about some of the aerodynamics and the pods and things. So it was all hidden stuff, very secret stuff. But I think Aston Martin said, here it is. And I think the next day or the day after, there was pictures of AMR 22 out on the track at Silverstone off for testing. So top marks for Aston Martin there, showing us the car, and here it is, and off we go. Exciting year ahead for Formula One, and I think as long as there's consistency in the rules, as we referred to last year, I think we should have an exciting year ahead.
And it's historically significant this year for Aston Martin because it marks the centenary, 100 years since Aston Martin first raced in a Grand Prix race. It was, of course, on the 15th of July 1922 in Strasbourg, France. It was the French Grand Prix that year, and Aston Martins appeared for the very first time, driven by Louis Jabrowski and also a Brit by the name of Clive Gallop. Both cars retired. They unfortunately had engine problems, but it was the start of a long association with motorsport, of course, that we have with Aston Martin to this day. So really nice that on the anniversary, the centenary of Aston Martin first entering Grand Prix races, that they unveil a brand new car for us. It's quite exciting, isn't it?
It is, and that's the impetus for we mentioned this last time, the Aston Martin Heritage Festival on the 14th of August. It's going to celebrate the 100 years of Grand Prix racing for Aston Martin, the centenary. So you can book now. Tickets are still available on the Aston Martin Heritage website. Go to there and you'll find a link and book your tickets. It's going to be an amazing event. We will speak more in detail on as we get nearer the time, but that's the reason behind it.
Well, we'll share more details on that event as they emerge over coming podcasts here on the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. But now we're going to find out all about gearboxes as Garry goes and finds out all about the cogs and the stuff that goes round, the black magic that is Aston Martin gearboxes next.
Immerse yourself in the rich heritage of Aston Martin. The cars, the people, the history. The Aston Martin Heritage Podcast.
Well, I'm delighted that today I'm at HWM in Walton-on-Thames. And today I'm with Guy Jenner, who is the Chief Executive Officer. Guy, thank you very much for joining our podcast.
Thanks, Garry, and welcome to HWM.
This place has a particular emotion for me because back when I was 17 years old, which was probably more years than I choose to remember, I passed my driving test on the 4th of July. I always remember that because it was American Independence Day. I was 17 years old. And I had a Mini 850 1960 Morris Mini. Thank you very much.
Yep.
And where was I going to go with that? And I think 1 or 2 days later, my drive from Yateley in Hampshire was to this very place in my little Mini 850 to look at Aston Martins, because I think one day that's going to happen. And I came here, and it was a marvellous. I think you had a joint Aston Martin British Leyland dealership at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's
you
right.
Did.
Yeah.
And I had a marvellous time. I think I saw what was called a V8 saloon there, and I think I sneaked out a brochure. I think I managed to charm my way for a brochure. So thank you very much. It was you've got to look after the children, the young people, haven't you? They are the future.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You are one of the world's most established dealerships for Aston Martin. Can you give us some background, Guy?
Well, that's right. So officially, we're the oldest Aston Martin dealership in the world. I think what's probably more accurate is we're the longest surviving Aston Martin dealership in the world, because as we know, Aston Martin have had some turbulent times over the years, and somehow we've managed to survive through. But we started off as a constructor of Grand Prix cars, and our two founders, George Abacassis and John Heath, were hugely into their racing, but George in particular was an Aston Martin works race driver. And how we became to be an Aston Martin dealership was in 1950. George actually won his class in Le Mans in an Aston Martin, and as was the way, Aston Martin said, well, you better sell them for us as well, which we duly did. So 1951 we became an Aston Martin dealer and never looked back, and I think that was sealed by the fact that George ended up dating the daughter of David Brown,
right,
who he married. So it was in the family, and we never looked back. Sadly, Heath lost his life in the Mille Miglia. Racing was a dangerous place back then. That was 1956, and so Mike Harting, who was the global sales manager for Aston Martin up the road at Feltham, came to the business to be George's partner, and that was 1958, and Mike sadly passed away in March, but he never left after that, and so the business has sort of had this consistent ownership, and we're still a privately owned family business today.
I feel very comfortable that you're in a position to talk about the subject we are going to be talking about for this podcast, which is manual gearboxes on an Aston Martin.
I hope so. So I think I'm probably a little biased because I love a manual gearbox. So this is a great subject to talk about, and we've made some wonderful cars with manual gearboxes. But what's probably triggered this podcast for us today is the fact that as of 2022 model year, we will no longer be able to supply a manual gearbox, which is currently in Vantage. So that will be the end of the manual gearbox in our core model lineup. It's not possible to order one unless something special happened via the queue department. So nothing's impossible, but it will not be a standard offering currently, and for as far as I can see in the future.
Well, that's interesting, because I am like you, Guy. I mean, I like a gearbox. It might be a generational thing, I don't know, but if I may just quote, and I do a name check here, to Henry Catchpole from Evo magazine, he said, manual gearbox, they are the vinyl to the music Spotify, the log fire to the electric radiator, and the mechanical instead of the quartz watch.
Despite being a lover of manual gearboxes, it's difficult to argue that they are better than an automatic gearbox in any measurable way. Nowadays, with a modern gearbox. So that has certainly changed across the period. So a good example is, today we're going to talk about what might be described as modern era Aston Martin. So cars that were built from Gaydon onwards, that were built on the VH platform. And we'll come to what VH platform means. But if you take the series before Gaydon era, DB7, well, at that point, if you were to choose an automatic over a manual gearbox, actually you were choosing a car of a lower performance level. So if you were to take the original DB7 i6 with a supercharged engine in a manual, it would do 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds, and it would do 165 miles an hour. If you bought the auto, it would do 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds, and it was given a top speed of 160 miles an hour. And that was even more extreme at the end of DB7. So DB7 GT, beautiful car, last of the DB7s. A manual DB7 GT had 14 more brake horsepower. It had a top speed of 184 miles an hour. If you chose the auto, it had a top speed of 165. So that's quite a marked difference. So I think in that era you were making a choice of the higher performance car, first of all.
Yeah.
So there was one attraction to manuals. I think also for me, why do I love manuals? The one thing I disagree with, first of all, is I hear people say, I like a manual because I've got greater control. I don't believe that, because actually with modern autos, or indeed dual clutch transmissions, you've got the ability to override the gearbox and control the car. what I do feel is, first of all, primarily it's fun. You've got greater involvement in the drive, and for me there's a huge amount of satisfaction in terms of manually executing a beautiful gear shift that's fast and smooth, and in particular coming down the gearbox, if you heel and toe and rev match as you come back down, again just nailing those changes perfectly. There's just something about the satisfaction of doing it yourself. And I think there's probably times with a manual gearbox that if you get stuck in a traffic jam, I can think of
absolutely, yeah.
Goodwood Revival. But one of my colleagues, it took them 2 hours to get into Goodwood the other day. Well, those are probably circumstances where you're perhaps not so in love with a manual gearbox, but generally it's just that involvement factor that I think is the biggest attraction.
Do you think that is what prompted the previous management team, Andy Palmer, under his guidance, when he said as long as he is there and under his watch, there will always be a manual gearbox option within the Aston Martin range, because he probably felt the clients at the time and the customers at the time were still wanting that engagement with the cars, which maybe not so much in Lamborghini or Ferrari.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think it comes from a place of passion more than anything else. And, in all my time working with Aston Martin, I've always felt that as a manufacturer, they've been full of people who love cars and love driving. And inevitably, if you love cars and driving, there's a good chance you probably quite like a manual gearbox. So I think it came from a place of passion. And of course, frankly, the world of the internet, if you were to believe everything you read on there, everybody wants a manual.
I believe you got the actual quote from Andy Palmer.
I do.
Do you want to read that out?
So this was Feb 2017, and he said, "I've already made a commitment that I want to be the last manufacturer in the world to offer manual sports cars, and I want to honour that commitment." It came from a good place, and frankly, subsequently, manual gearbox was delivered in Vantage. So
yes.
It was executed upon. We'll come to what's happened.
Yes.
In the life of manual gearbox of Advantage, but definitely the honourable intention was there.
But as we all know, we have a new management team. Aston Martin has a new management team with Tobias Moers heading this, and he has quite clearly said the manual gearbox is over.
Yes.
So do you think that it's a generational thing, we're looking ahead? Because I did see I think it was someone on the internet saying the manual gearbox will actually be the ultimate anti-theft device. Because somebody will try to break into a car, see it's got a stick and a third pedal, and they won't have a clue what to do with it. So if we are looking ahead, a decade or two ahead, is the management team correct, do you think, saying, well, manual gearboxes, we can understand the romance, we can understand the engagement, but current gearboxes are moved on so much from, should we say, like you mentioned, the DB7, that in reality, and from a business case point of view, they're no longer required.
Yeah, I think it's probably as much to do with the advancement of the auto gearbox as it is to do with the manual. And so I think there's a few things. For me, roads are getting busier, so that's certainly an incentive. I think autos, first of all, you have the ability to put more gear ratios into an auto gearbox. So if you look at a modern Aston Martin, it's got an 8-speed ZF box. Well, you wouldn't want to be changing 8 speeds.
Well, as a manual, you'd be forever stirring.
You would, yeah. It would be a constant job. So I think that enables an automatic to, one, have faster acceleration, because you can have closely stacked ratios lower down the box, but equally you can have much higher overdrive ratios. So the fuel economy you get at cruising is superb. The shift speeds are super fast, and actually they are far more efficient, i.e. there's less transmission losses now, so more of the power from the engine is getting to the rear wheels. That was always an issue historically. So if for every reason auto boxes are getting better, I think there's pressure on CO2 emissions as well.
Well, absolutely, because I understand the more gears you have, the more the engine can be optimised to reduce consumption and emissions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's probably true even of those of us that love manuals. When we drive our manuals, there's probably the odd time where we wish we had an automatic, and there's probably times where we're very, very grateful for having manual gearboxes.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So we mentioned the DB7.
Yes.
And I think that was probably I know it's pre-VH, but and you can refer to that in a moment. But the DB7, they offered this Touchtronic, and unfortunately at the time I had a manual DB7 and I thoroughly loved it. And I did try a DB7 Volante with a Touchtronic at Goodwood.
Yeah.
My experience with that, I think we'll gloss over, and we'll move on to another day. I still bear the scars. I think Les Goebel would chuckle at this, but we'll move on. So, needless to say, I didn't get on too well with the Touchtronic.
Yeah.
But then it was a generational shift, wasn't there? We went from DB7 to DB9, and I think the gearbox had moved on tremendously since then, didn't it?
I agree. Yeah. So first of all, we refer to VH platform, which is vertical horizontal platform. Actually, the VH stands for. This was a platform in the days of Ford where vertical it could go up and down the Aston Martin range, and horizontally, in theory, it could go across other Ford-owned manufacturers. And it was a fantastic platform that was flexible, very, very strong, and was therefore used throughout the Aston range. So when we say VH, that's what we're talking about. And yeah, DB9 was the first full VH product, launched in 2004. Now, DB9 was auto to begin with. It was a ZF auto.
Was it?
Yeah. So you couldn't get manual for the early cars.
And it was the buttons on the dashboard, wasn't it?
That's it. Yeah, and they worked really well. So it was a Graziano manual when it became a manual, but it was a ZF auto. And we're still at the point where it was pretty close on outright performance figures. So we're at a point where the manual was still just a bit quicker than the auto against the clock. And we'll talk about how they feel to drive in a moment. The important thing about an Aston setup typically is they have a transaxle setup. So they have the gearbox mounted at the back,
yeah,
the rear axle. And the really important thing for Aston is typically we don't build the lightest cars, but what we do build is we build a car that is a very sporty GT, and it's all about managing the weight. So that's why they mount the gearbox at the back. So it's neat packaging, but the weight distribution is really critical. So transaxle gearbox. Interestingly, the manual gearbox had lower gearing than the automatic. So that was a different feel on the road. But still, it was at a point where, 0.1 seconds faster for a manual 0 to 60. It was slightly quicker against the clock. So the manual gearbox was introduced in 2005, and it ended up being dropped for 2013 model year. So it did eight years of the total 12.
Well, that's not too shabby, is it?
It's not too shabby, but I mean there were over 16,000 DB9s made, and in total 622 were manual.
No.
So it's a super, less than 5%.
I didn't realise it was that.
Really small numbers. 385 were coupe, 237 were Volante. But actually, for big GT cars, I think in modern era, generally they suit an automatic. Generally. But when you drive a manual DB9, wow! I mean, it's a real gem of a car. So because first of all, the gearing's lower, so you notice it's punchier straight away. It makes more use of its engine and its power. It's got a very light flywheel, so it revs up quickly, which takes some getting used to, actually, because as you're trying to balance it to pull away on the clutch and so on, it's very easy to over rev the engine because it responds so quickly. So I can imagine in the wrong hands it can eat clutches.
It seems to be a common Aston fear.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, yeah. So it's something you've got to be wary of. But wow, I mean, for me, it transformed the car. It made it really, really lively. The gearbox was always slightly bulky, so a little awkward and a little heavy, but the clutch really quite nice and light relative to, I always think whenever you get into a V12 manual, you think it's going to be incredibly hard work.
Yes.
But actually, they are relative to what they are. They're pretty sensible to drive. But I think a common theme with all of the manual Astons is they are not instantly flattering. You have to get used to them. So, one of the things I wonder is, over the years, are these cars that, one, it would probably be pretty difficult back in the day when DB9s have been sold. If you wanted to go and test drive a DB9 manual, well, you'd have a challenge because, frankly, I would imagine pretty much every dealer always had an automatic.
Absolutely, yeah.
And not a manual. So
would you buy it on faith?
You'd probably have to buy it on faith, yeah. And frankly, even if you test drove the car, it's my feeling that a common theme we'll have with all of these cars, maybe with the exception of DBS and V12 Vantage, a lot of them you need to drive for quite a while to get used to them and get into them. DB9's a great example of that. I think if you drove it for 20 minutes, you'd probably come back and think, I'm not sure. If you drove it for 3 days, you'd probably fall in love with it.
Oh, that's interesting. That is very interesting. Because the engagement with cars usually happens within the first few miles, doesn't it, really, generally speaking? Definitely. Yeah.
But you can see why, probably of all the models we're going to discuss, a manual gearbox is probably the least likely fit for the DB9. It was always the Grand Tourer, the central pillar of the Aston range. Vantage was sportier, DBS was sportier, DB9 was sitting in the middle. Still a very sporty GT, but absolutely a GT.
But still a GT.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can see why, and I was amazed by those production figures, why it was such a niche area.
Can you remember the first time you saw a DBS? I can remember it vividly, and...
it was probably a James Bond film.
Oh, was it James Bond film? Yeah, okay, so for me, I can remember seeing a Casino Royale DBS manual sitting there on the tarmac, and I just thought it was the most beautifully proportioned car. And the fact that it had a manual gearbox in it was even more attractive to me.
So the DBS came out of a manual?
Yeah, so interestingly, manual only to begin with.
Right.
So as DBS was launched until 2009 model year, so it was launched in... it was introduced 2007, first cars were built 2008, and really it was late 8, early 2009 that the Auto came out. So it had this 6-speed manual.
So do you feel that the Auto came through demand?
Yeah, I do, definitely. And I suspect commercially Aston Martin felt that they were ignoring a big opportunity with auto transmission. So they were both offered concurrently. So there was a period of time where you could buy both an auto and a manual. Big thing that I always remember, opening the door of a DBS, had a beautiful interior, but it had this colossal gear lever that was machined from solid aluminium.
Oh yes, I remember. They said like a Cyberman's head or something like that.
What a showpiece. And
pure aluminium, wasn't it?
Yeah, machined from solid. So the plus sides. So I think it gave the gearbox a bit of assistance with leverage. So it actually felt quite light in use, but on a cold day, I've never known anything colder. And then the opposite, on a hot day, it felt like it was just going to melt your skin. So why they had never sold as an accessory a left-handed glove for changing gear, I don't know. I think Aston missed a trick there, but I still love it. It's part of the experience of a manual DBS, that beautiful gear lever, and combined with even more power than DB9. So it had 510 brake horsepower, less weight.
Yes.
It was a really lively car to drive. And I think the same thing happened, that when Auto was introduced in 2009 model year, it actually just took the edge of the performance in auto form. So I think manual always felt a bit livelier, but there were a few options that came in 2009 model year. Automatic, B&O sound system became standard, and there was a 2+2 seating option. And in the history of Astons, those +2 seats have always been useless, but they've always been one of those mandatory options that everybody specs.
Absolutely.
Just the way it goes. So those options came up, but in total, 984 DBS were built with a manual gearbox. Total production run was 3,400. The last cars were built in 2011, and essentially what happened was, as soon as we started offering automatic, a large proportion of the buyers were ordering autos. Overnight, it just changed everything. That everybody switched to auto.
That's interesting, isn't it? That's very interesting. Okay.
So in total, production numbers as a split on DBS, there were 984 manual coupes, 1,552 auto coupes by comparison. Here's a really rare model, the manual Volante. So it was available in manual, the Volante. That is a rare car. 45 were made.
You do lose track sometimes because Aston Martin are not shy in spinning off various derivatives of their models, are they?
No.
Because we had the Virage as well between the DBS and the DB9 as well,
That's
didn't
right.
we?
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
So 45 manual Volantes versus 803 auto Volantes. So that gives you an idea of the split. Now, one of the rarest combos is to have a later car. So once auto had been made available in 2009 model year, if you ordered a 2+2 seat configuration that had B&O but was a manual, that's a rare car. So that's 114 of those were made. So they're really sought after too.
And I'm seeing the DBSs are getting quite punchy in their prices now, aren't they?
They are. Yeah. So not only is it a beautiful car, I think it's wonderfully proportioned. It's been in a Bond film twice over. That's great.
Yeah.
And actually, naturally aspirated V12s with a manual gearbox. That's a configuration that's quite rare in the marketplace.
That's a good point. A naturally aspirated V12 and a manual. What's not to like?
Yeah.
What's not to like indeed.
So they're a wonderful car, and what then subsequently came was pretty much that configuration, but squeezed into the smaller body of the Vantage. And again, so what's not to like from there? That's...
Well, I do remember. I think it was the Design Museum opening. I can't remember when. You may have 2000.
December 11th of December 2007.
2007.
There or thereabouts.
It was a blue
Mako blue.
Baby Aston.
Yes.
V12 engine.
Yes.
Now, what's not to like there?
It was incredible. So it was called the RS, and I think Dr. Bears revealed the car, as part of the design studio, and hinted that it might go into production. Well, sure enough, March 2008 in Geneva, it went into production. It was revealed and confirmed as going into production, and this was an incredible car. So they dropped the RS tag, so it was simply known as V12 Vantage. And we'll talk a little bit about the car, but I can remember being back at the dealership, just taking deposits from people as they sort of got off the Geneva stand. Again, what's not to like? So it had that same DBS configuration of the 510 brake horsepower naturally aspirated V12, but squeezed into the smaller body of the Vantage, which was really tightly packaged. I mean, it was a real achievement to get it in there. It had the same manual gearbox, that same gear lever as well. So, and again, all the better for it. Even the same brakes. So it was one of the fastest decelerating cars you could buy. It just had an instant impact, and that combined with a shorter wheelbase, fast steering rack. It was a really lively car, and a few things about it. Interestingly, it wasn't that much lighter than DBS.
Really?
Yeah. So you'd imagine it would be a lot lighter. It's probably in the region of 50 kilograms, something like that.
It's not much at all, is it?
Not huge.
That's a gearbox weight or something. Yeah.
But to drive the two.
So it was launched as a manual, was it?
Launched the manual, and all the way through the V12 Vantage's life, before it gained the S version, it was manual only. Never an auto. I don't think there was. I don't know whether it was room or raciness, but they never offered an auto configuration. But it was 140 millimetres shorter than DBS in terms of wheelbase. So, in terms of the way they drove, they were just really lively, really punchy on the road.
Totally different character.
Yeah, very edgy. So it had fixed rate dampers rather than the DBS had adaptive damping and a long wheelbase. So you generally got a better ride on a DBS, whilst V12 Vantage had a lively ride. It was firmer, edgier, and it was also supplied on dry biased Pirelli P0 Corsas. And if there was even the merest hint of moisture in the air, the car was all over the place. Actually, that's a bit unfair to say it was all over the place. It could break traction very easily, and you could rotate in a controlled fashion, but you needed to bring your A game. But that, for me, that was part of the attraction of the car. It was a car that demanded respect, and there's never a dull day driving a V12 Vantage. It scared a few people to the point
Yeah.
where there were a few cars that were sold back to us because I think a few customers felt, you know what, this is just a bit much day to day.
Yeah.
But for me, that's even, you know, that adds even more allure to the car. You know, that's. But you're absolutely right. It's maximum engagement. But you know, if for a chunk of these cars, they're not daily drivers. They're owned as a second or a third or a fourth car. And if you want something to get out of the garage when you're in the mood to just go and drive and just purely concentrate on your driving, what a piece of kit to own.
I can imagine. You said earlier that after a few hours, I think it was the DB9 or the DB, they didn't like the manual gearbox, but after a longer period of time, they did. I do remember when I think I mentioned to you when we met a while back before the podcast.
Yeah.
That many years ago, I was invited to Aston Martin to test drive or take out for the Aston Martin Owners Club magazine a V12 Vantage there.
Yeah.
It wasn't a manual,
Yeah.
so probably one of the later generation. And I wafted up there in a Jaguar. It was an SJR. It was lovely, you know, 4-litre supercharged.
Great car.
Anyway, they threw me the key or the emotional control unit.
Emotional control unit.
That's
yes.
it.
Yep.
They
Yep.
threw that at me. Off you go, Gary. And you know, to jump from a Jaguar XJR to that was sensational. And I went down on the M40, still finding my way around, and I saw something called a sport button.
Yeah.
What does that do, Gary? Well, it did a lot. All hell and fury. And this, I mean, as you say, this car was just, a lot was happening. And I can imagine people jumping into it, oh, this looks rather nice, and coming back. I wouldn't say scared, but love it, but too much. Now, having said that, I had it for the weekend and I got used to it. But
Yes.
my goodness, you had to respect that car.
Yeah, I agree. Funnily enough, just around town and low-speed manoeuvres, I actually found V12 Vantage and DBS really quite easy cars to drive. You know, gearbox was light, clutch was light, the throttle and just the way the car revved was all actually quite manageable. And of course, the one thing you get with a V12 is just that enormous flexibility. So frankly, gear choice, you know, it didn't require you to be ultra precise on what gear you chose. Third gear would take you from just above walking pace to licence losing pace. You know, it's a very flexible unit. It's when you want to drive one a bit quicker that you really need to be respectful at the same time. So V12 Vantage, we were at an era where I think at the end of the S, the world kind of recognised quite clearly that naturally aspirated engines were at the end of their life. Manual gearboxes were becoming rarer. And certainly we found at dealership level there was an element of the market or customer base that thought, I'm never going to get a chance to buy another car like this. But it still felt to me that with V12 Vantage S it was criminally overlooked because it was such a great car. And yeah, I mean, it didn't sell in the numbers it deserved to. So to give you a feel for numbers, so V12 Vantage S, the Sport Shift version, in total 1,017 were sold. By comparison, a quarter of that, 260, were sold in manual form. Roadster, just 91 manuals were sold versus 272 S's with Sport Shift. The AMR was a limited car, but the split was 57 manual coupes, 18 Sport Shifts, 23 manual Roadsters, and 6 Sport Shift Roadsters. Even though the writing was on the wall for a manual gearbox like that, I think the market is starting to wake up to it now. But
Do you think? Yeah.
But people, often we don't realise we're going to miss something until it's gone. I was just going to mention what it was like to drive a V12 Vantage S because we've spoken about the spikiness of V12. Actually, V12 S is a slightly more rounded product. So it had adaptive damping, so that calmed the ride down a bit.
It smoothed it out, did it? It took the rough edges of it.
Well, it did. There's a phrase that Aston use which resonates throughout their range. They've always worked harder and harder on breadth of ability, i.e. it's creating a car that when you want to drive in a committed fashion, you can tighten it all up and it becomes that absolute sharp weapon that you want. But equally, you can soften it all off and it's a nice GT car to make make progress in. And V12 Vantage S did that better than V12. It had an extra gear, so it had taller gearing, so better cruising. Strong torque, so even from just 1,000 RPM, it had 70 Newton meters more torque than the non-S. So you could feel that straight away. And it had a 177 muffler, so it had a different noise. And, well, as soon as you mention 177, that's never going to be a bad thing, is it?
Well, no, I didn't know that. Okay.
So over and above the gearbox, it's a really compelling combo. But for me, yeah, they're both wonderful cars for different reasons. They just, I guess my point being is they've got distinctly different characters, but they're both wonderful cars and both savage when you drive them really hard. Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned the 177 connection there.
Yeah.
And I think any connection with 177 is never a bad thing. I think that's very much a lust after Aston, but obviously the 177 led into Project Victor, didn't it?
It did. So if we talk more V12 before we move to the V8 Vantage, there have been two notable manual specials over the last few years. The first one, actually, I would refer to might be V600. So V600 started life at HWM, and it was a customer that commissioned the project, and it actually started with that customer owning a V12 Vantage S, loving it, and perhaps wanting to make the ultimate V12 Vantage, or maybe the ultimate Vantage, full stop, something that could be kept long term, because it was very apparent then that it was the end of an era for that model. And there were a number of things that influenced it. GT12, for example. GT12 was made with a 600 brake horsepower V12 engine, but it was always a sport shift gearbox. The customer wanted something distinctly analogue to go with that NA engine, so it had the 7-speed manual, the highest power output, wide body, and there's so much to the V600 in terms of changes to the body and interior that you perhaps wouldn't know.
And what's the 600 refer to?
Its code name. Yeah. So it had a code name called, it was Project Dreadnought.
Project Dreadnought.
Which is a brilliant name. So it was always known internally as the Dreadnought. And again, that was led by the customer. It was a brilliant name, and frankly, the naming of V600 was probably the last thing that happened with the project. So it wasn't a car that was inspired by the previous V600. We just created this, what we think is just a wonderful analogue driver's car that's kind of, it represents everything that Aston Martin typically delivers, i.e. it's menacing but beautiful but under the radar, and it's driver focused, yet it's got this incredibly bespoke tailored interior and exterior. It's a wonderful car. So we got to the end of this project. It was called the Dreadnought. It was a 600 brake horsepower Vantage, and as you'll know, with Astons, its name's beginning with V, and so we thought, where do we go with this? It's still Vantage because it's a love letter to Vantage, really. And so V600 seemed like a good match with a 600 brake horsepower output. So that's how it came about. Actually, I've read many times in magazines that it was inspired by the V600. It definitely wasn't.
Right. Okay.
So that was a great car and one of my favourites. And it's all about manual gearboxes and
how many gears in that gearbox?
7-speed.
So it
was actually the same 7-speed as the V12 Vantage S.
Right.
And yeah, great gears. Again, it looks very different inside. But yeah, beautiful car, ultra low volume. There were 7 coupes and 7 roadsters made.
I didn't realise that they did that many, actually. I always thought it was just 1 or 2 off. But as I say, I looked in your showroom, and they are beautiful looking cars, aggressive but understated. Under the radar, I should say.
Yeah, very much under the radar. It was originally going to be a 1 of 1, and Aston Martin asked if they could build more, because they recognised that there was definitely an element of customers who would really appreciate an analogue car like that, and so that's why it grew to a slightly larger project, but nevertheless ultra rare, and built for people who just love driving. Which then leads us to the other special project, the Victor. And the Victor was a car that was inspired by the Muncher. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Muncher, well, in fact, Gary, you mentioned that the Muncher is one of your favourites.
Oh, it's utterly my favourite Aston Martin. I think it's probably... I remember, 1977 comes to mind.
Yeah.
Long before the internet, long before everything, and it was at Le Mans. And the only way I can keep up to date with what was going on at Le Mans was watching it on BBC Teletext. You know, just thing. And then the next week I'll grab Motoring News or Motoring News it was called, and not as in Motorsport News now, and Autosport. And I wanted to see how Muncher did, because it looked like an Aston Martin, but a mad one. But what a fantastic looking car! It was. I just loved it, and it's a schoolboy poster car. It was just pure excess, but I would say under the radar.
No.
But certainly not that. But you saw it as an Aston Martin with on steroids and had attitude there, and I just loved it. So when Victor came along, wow.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny, I think on track, different rules in terms of Aston's aesthetics apply. But you're right. I mean, it feels as if even to call it an Aston on steroids isn't enough. It was just wild, wasn't it?
It was wild, and the colour scheme, the red, white, and blue. I think it just ticked all the boxes, Guy. I think it was patriotic. It was an Aston Martin. It was at Le Mans. It was trying to give those pesky foreigners a scene to.
Yeah.
You know, it was marvellous. It was marvellous, and
it was probably a bit of an underdog as well, which again to hold it all up.
Absolutely.
And it had those incredible gold wheels as well, and I'm just overall as a look, it was incredible. Yeah, just a remarkable thing, and that's what inspired the Victor project. And what was found out was that there was a 177 chassis lying around at Gaydon,
as you do,
that was a usable chassis, and the carbon had all been checked, and there was a customer who wanted to build a car that was inspired by the Muncher. Generally, the only other thing we haven't mentioned about the Muncher is the reason why it was called the Muncher was because it used to eat brakes.
Absolutely.
Which wasn't something that I think we wanted to faithfully recreate with the Victor. So it's got carbon ceramics that are pretty robust. But there we go. That was more a weight issue.
I think it was the next generation Muncher when it had twin turbos,
yes.
And I think it. I think it was doing about 2 miles to the gallon or something. Yeah. It couldn't even complete a circuit.
It became even more extreme though, didn't it?
More extreme, yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So originally Victor was going to be in that colour scheme, and
with the red, white, and blue.
Yeah, with gold wheels.
Fantastic.
And this shape, it's such a beautiful shape. The Victor, it's brutish. I could never describe it as pretty. It's handsome and brutish, but it again encapsulates everything an Aston should be with this big oversized engine. In this case it's a V12 that's putting out over 800 brake horsepower.
And if I'm understanding, was it Victor was initiated by you or a customer of yours?
That's right. Yeah. So it started by a customer of ours, and we were involved in the project quite heavily. It ended up being taken over by a customer from Belgium in the end. But it was an incredible experience. So again, manual gearbox.
Yeah.
And the same trick was played as we spoke about the V12 Vantage S with the 7-speed sport shift, taking off the robotised elements, making it a manual. Well, of course, 177 was a sport shift gearbox, and what happened was the robotised element was taken off to leave it as a core manual. So suddenly Victor had elements of the Vulcan running suspension and so on.
Yes.
It had this beautiful naturally aspirated V12, big boots, comfortable seats. It's a car that you could track, take it long distance, just everything you'd hope an Aston to be. So V8 engines.
V8 Vantage.
V8 Vantage, yeah, indeed.
Current generation.
So V8 Vantage was not far behind DB9. So DB9 was launched in 2004, and it was a year later that we saw V8 Vantage. So again, it was on the same platform, but a shorter platform. And this probably, of all of the cars, understandably, was the most successful manual gearbox. And for me, straight away, It was the sportiest model. It's a sports car. So I think that went with manual gearboxes. It was originally only a manual that was available with Vantage. So Sport Shift came later in its life, but it was just a beautiful combination of a naturally aspirated V8, a conventional 6-speed manual. So nothing complicated about the gearbox. You can kind of get on with it. Other than the fact that we were saying earlier that sometimes it might have been a little bit mechanical and heavy, but actually drive it for a little while and you forget that, I think. It's just like if you've ever driven a manual with a heavy clutch and then you get out of it and drive something with a light clutch, you forget what a light clutch feels like. You almost stomp on the light clutch.
Yes, that's a very good point. You think, well, this is the norm.
Yeah, you adjust. But it's just a wonderful combination, and particularly with a V8 engine, what you get with Vantage is it was a front mid-engine car, so there was more room to play with because they don't have unlike the V12, which was shoehorned in there, the V8 engine was mounted much further back, so the balance of a V8 is just beautiful. It's a great car. Now, there were 2 versions of Sport Shift available in Vantage, a 6-speed and a 7-speed. And when it first came out, the Sport Shift, the big selling point was that gear changes were up to 3 times faster than a manual transmission. So the early Sport Shifts were able to change in less than 200 milliseconds. So bear in mind, progress at the end of the V12 Vantage S's life, that came down to 70 milliseconds. It's all relative because actually nobody complains about manual gearbox change speeds, do they? You just don't hear that conversation.
No. I wish it could be faster.
Yeah.
You never hear that. No,
because unfortunately that involves blaming the driver, doesn't it? That's why. Equipped with a Sport Shift, the Vantage retained low polar moment of inertia, an excellent balance, as they described it. So it was negligible weight increase over manual. It still had that wonderful weight distribution, 49-51 weight distribution, and top speed this time was unchanged. It was 175 miles an hour for the early cars, and the 0 to 60 time was a little faster. So it was interesting. Now we're starting to get to a point where it evens things up a little bit, where when Sport Shift was finally introduced to the range, we're not at a point where there was a massive compromise in performance. Actually, they were pretty level. The interesting thing about Sport Shift was actually we still found that manuals outsold automatics, certainly, or Sport Shifts, I shouldn't call it an automatic, Sport Shifts, in the 4.3 variant. Probably one because it originally was available only in manual, but also it just took a bit of getting used to with the Sport Shift gearbox. So going back to the conversation we had earlier, if you drove a Sport Shift up the road and you didn't get your shifts right and your throttle interaction, you'd probably come back and think, well, that's just a horrible jerky gearbox. So first 4.3s, 6,408 manuals were sold versus 1,746 Sport Shift.
Okay.
So still far more manuals. Once we got to 4.7 non-S, it changed. 1,794 manuals were sold, 3,420 Sport Shifts were sold. And once we get to Roadster, we always found that Sport Shift was more popular than manual. So 4.3s, 727 manuals were sold versus 2,293 Sport Shift, and at 4.7 that was 507 manuals versus 1,816. But there was that same journey as the V12 once the S model was introduced. So the S model was introduced with suspension upgrades, more power, interior upgrades, and being the sports model, the sporty model, and in line with Aston's thinking at that point, it was Sport Shift only. 7-speed Sport Shift gearbox was introduced, and it was the best version of Sport Shift. But it's interesting that Aston eventually introduced Vantage S with a manual gearbox, so it came back to the market much the same time as the V12 manual returned for the S. In the end, similar balance. The rarest of manuals for for Vantage a V8S Roadster, of which there was only 63 made for the world.
Really, that's very low, isn't it? V8 Vantage S.
But that's a lovely car.
Yes,
it's a 6-speed, interestingly. So they didn't go 7-speed sport shift and then take the robotised element off. It was just the straightforward 6-speed manual.
Do you think the Roadsters just tend to offer a more relaxed style of driving, if I can use that?
Exactly.
So hence the non-manual seems to suit it better.
Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head. That
for the purpose that the person wants to drive it.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, people. I think generally the buyers consider a larger proportion of their driving might be touring, stroke cruising, and that might be just slightly different with the coupes. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. And not forgetting, we got GT8 with its full aero kit. So that 119 of those were manual, 36 were sport shift. So again, that the interesting thing about that is that's in theory a sort of almost track orientated car, yet far more people chose the manual. And then finally V8 AMR, 63 coupes, 74 as manual, 74 as sport shift, so pretty balanced. 12 Roadster manuals and 51 Roadster sport shift. It's just a lovely thing to drive as a manual gearbox of V8 Vantage. The other interesting thing is this is from an era of cars where actually bring out a manual today and you almost need to overgear it to bring down CO2 and fuel consumption.
Right.
And that just takes the edge of that sort of instant performance.
Do you think it's the CO2 that's been the final nail in the coffin? I think it is, isn't it? Because you're probably not getting the gear ratios that it should have.
Yep.
It's to pass the regulation.
Yep.
So I think it's a perfect storm, isn't it?
It is a perfect storm. Yeah, definitely. And so that brings us to we'll call it new Vantage, but current Vantage.
Does it have a designation? You know, I think Aston Martin with their naming, you do get a bit when somebody says V8 Vantage or Vantage, you think, well, hang on, which one are you talking about? So does the V8 current Vantage, does it have how can we identify it from the previous one? Do we just say new Vantage?
Do you know what? Currently that's the designation.
That's the kind.
It probably needs a designation. That would be really handy for all of us, I think.
Probably like Vanquish Generation 1, Generation 2, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, I think that's fair. And of course, this was a car that was launched as auto only, so
absolutely,
as opposed to the previous model, which was manual first and then sport shift came later. Current model was introduced in 2018, and then it was a couple of years, 18 months before the manual gearbox was made available, and it was launched as a Vantage AMR first of all.
That's right, and quite a considerable price uplift, was it?
It was. Yeah, exactly right. So it was a premium priced car, higher spec. They made 200 in total.
Yeah.
And
well, that's quite reasonable.
Yeah, and it was quite popular. But it was always going to be the case that it became a standard option in the range thereafter. So after the launch of AMR, and once they'd all sold, then you could
like the first edition, which seems to be the thing these days.
You got it. Yeah, exactly that. Then it became just a box you could tick the newer spec advantage. And actually, there was, first of all, a sizable price advantage to ordering a manual. So it was £6,000 less than an auto. Well, that's
really
not insignificant. So £6,000 less. Not only that, a chunk of time and effort went into engineering the manual gearbox, and it's everything from first of all, it had, instead of auto has an e-diff, this has got a full mechanical limited slip diff. They changed the springs, dampers, anti-roll bars. They even changed the brake pedal modulation and the placing of the pedals, just so that when you're on the brakes and you need to flip the throttle to rev match, they're not overly sensitive. You can just do it perfectly. I mean, there's been a load of attention to detail, and then the 7-speed manual gearbox going in saved 95 kilograms over the auto.
That's a slimline person.
It's a...
Is it? I'm trying to think of my weight. No, it's not me. It's a slimline person. Yes.
So I like it. It's a bigger weight saving than if you bought a Ferrari 488 versus a Pista lightweight. This is more of a lightweight than that difference. So
there's quite a few other changes.
Yeah. And then all the time, you've obviously got new centre console, new gear lever.
Yes.
It still had AM shift. This car needed crash testing, emissions. So, the commitment to building a manual would have been significant.
You begin to wonder about the business case behind it.
You're dead right. So I think Aston delivered upon their promise to build a manual gearbox.
Understandably.
And they built a great car.
Yeah.
Again, I still feel it's a car that you drive up the road, and if you drove it for 10 minutes, you think, I'm not sure about this. Not sure it's for me. You drive it for a couple of hours, and suddenly it clicks.
Right.
It's worth the effort. But
it's interesting you say worth the effort.
Yeah.
Because before I came up,
yeah.
I tweeted that I was coming up here to talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
We were going to talk about manual gearboxes. And one of my followers, Supercar Adventurer, he said he's got a new Vantage.
Yes.
And he said you have to get used to it. And he says, why is the gearbox so clunky? Is it a clunky gearbox?
Yeah, I think it is.
It is.
In fairness, but I think you have to adapt to your driving style. So, i.e., first time I drove that car, first 10 minutes, I was clunky. That's the problem. But actually, if I get into one now and I'm far more familiar with them, I can execute smooth, fast shifts. I've had to work at that to get to that
So
point.
you have to adapt.
Definitely.
Do you feel customers these days, clients these days, there's a need for perhaps the cars to adapt to them? They should, they just want to get in and go? Do you
I think there's a phenomenal amount of products out there that are hugely flattering, that do everything for you.
Yes.
And adapt to you rather than you adapt to them. And technically, from an engineering point of view, that's wonderful. That's very clever. But I don't want to get into a car necessarily that's just so easy. I'm not so much a part of the process. But I can understand why that would attract lots of people. So I don't make people wrong for getting irritated by these aspects. But for me, that's part of the journey. But interestingly, in total, Aston will have made less than 400 manuals for the world. So that doesn't feel like a great investment to me. That they put a lot of weight, a lot of effort and time and money into creating a manual gearbox. And to answer the question, why is it clunky? Well, Aston have used an already established manual gearbox that's been part of their range. They haven't started from scratch. They've done the right thing, because the reason people haven't bought the car isn't because they're coming in and saying, I don't like it to drive. The reality is we didn't have the inquiries on. In my own personal experience, people phoning up and saying, I want to come and try that manual, people were just still going towards the auto gearbox, because there's nothing to dislike about the ZF. It's just a brilliant gearbox. So I think even if they built a wonderfully slick, easy to use conventional 6-speed manual, let's say,
yes,
I don't think that would have been the difference. But I do understand that certain people will find it a bit notchy to begin with. But I think you work around that.
And that's where we are. I can't buy a V8 manual, brand new V8 Vantage off you now, because that's the end of it.
Yes.
Unless Q department come along, which I'm sure they're quite happy to take someone's check. Yeah, we'll put a gearbox in for you. But as a core product range, end of the year, and of course we've got electrification coming up, which is going to kill the gearbox anyway, isn't it? The manual gearbox in any case. It
is, yeah, absolutely. And I think don't underestimate the cost of engineering, because I always call the Q department the could you just department, because those are the questions they generally get asked that begin with could you just. And the cost of, because we've had questions over the years, I'd love a Zagato, could you just put a manual gearbox in it? Well, yeah, but
yes, but
the cost of doing that is just eye-watering.
I think, is it Simon Lane who's
yes.
who heads that? I think I'm reading somewhere, even some of the smallest changes by Q, it's phenomenal. I think I've read something about the seatbelt webbing.
Yep.
If you wanted to change that, I think it just has to be type approved again, and the cost behind this is just phenomenal.
And what sounds like a simple request, maybe a gearbox isn't, but some that you find with you what sounds like a simple request, the moment you start looking into what's actually involved, I don't feel disappointed in Aston Martin removing the manual gearbox from the range. I think it makes absolute commercial sense from their point of view.
When the new team came in, saw too much red ink on the spreadsheet.
Exactly that, and I think they have delivered here's a manual gearbox, everyone, who wants to buy it? And ultimately the demand, yeah, exactly. The demand hasn't been there. So I don't think it's Aston failing the market. I think it's the market saying, voting with their feet. Actually, what I think is probably going to cause the demand to steadily increase more than anything is actually, I think, one, cars are becoming so capable, and two, becoming so fast, whether they're electric or combustion. I think we'll get to the point where we think, do you know what, 1,000 brake horsepower, 2,000 brake horsepower, it's all a bit meaningless. Having something that's a bit more interactive, as certainly as a weekend car, probably will hold its appeal. Frankly, for our daily cars, I think manuals are pretty much dead and buried long term.
Yeah.
But definitely, it's recreational cars. Yeah, I think there will always be an element of demand there where people want that.
Guy, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Jack.
Well, a brilliant interview there, Gary, and quite sad, I think, that the true manual gearbox with a stick in your hand is consigned to the history books. But an interesting point there, that the reason for that is not anything that's led by the manufacturer, it's market forces. It's what people are buying and what people are demanding that Aston Martin makes for them, and that's the important point there. But a brilliant insight there from HWM.
I say, we spoke about the end of the manual gearbox, and Tim Cottingham, who I mentioned earlier, the registrar, he did point out that manual gearboxes still exist. What we are really talking about is the end of the third pedal and the gear stick. I think there's the sports shift, which through the flappy paddles still operate a manual gearbox. But when we refer to manual gearbox, we're still thinking of the good old stick and the third pedal. So, it's fascinating stuff. Thank you, Guy.
Well, don't forget as well, we'd like to hear from you if you have particular stories to share with us here on the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. We're always keen to hear from you if you have a period of long ownership, perhaps, or a particular experience you'd like to share. Perhaps you've worked around Aston Martin or worked with Aston Martin. We'd like to hear from you. It's really easy to get in touch. Simply go to the website astonmartinheritagepodcast.com, click the contact button there, and you can fill out the form, get in touch with us, and we'll be in touch with you to put you on this podcast. But for episode 4, it's goodbye from me, Wayne Scott.
And it's goodbye from me, Garry Taylor.
See ya.
The Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Subscribe and get new episodes delivered to your device automatically via astonmartinheritagepodcast.com.